And knowing is half the battle. G.I. Joe! Go, Joe!
Now I know!
And knowing is half the battle.
G.I. Joe!
Hey there, Catherine here. I know that was corny, and my childhood is totally creeping up on me through nostalgia, but there is a reason that old line resonates with me. I grew up totally hooked on G.I. Joe in the U.S. Army. When I went to college, I looked at the National Guard as an option to help cover my college costs with the GI Bill. My ex-husband, he double-dipped. After college, he got the loan repayment and the GI Bill for a second bachelor's. The unused portion of the bill was passed to my children. I now have 2 master's degrees, one in English language and literature, and the other is a joint master's in history and politics. I homeschooled my children for a bit while we were constantly moving around, and am a huge supporter of education. Knowing is half the battle. This does not mean only college, but K through 12 and trade school. Once people leave school, the learning should not stop. I get it. The rat race is exhausting. It is very easy to come home and plop in front of the TV or watch videos online and veg. In these videos, you see a couple bookcases behind me. This room actually has 6 bookcases. I may be able to squeeze one more in. My husband might kill me for it, though. At last count, we have about 1,000 books in our house. This is about 25 years of accumulation. While I have a few novels, most of them are history books with a decent selection of crafting. Point is, I never stopped learning. My best friend recently retired and brought up my suggestion of auditing university courses. This is where one can take courses for a reduced price or free, depending on the school. Okay, here in Germany, we can take them dirt cheap. Where I studied in America, they're free to people over 60, but full price to anyone younger. Big thing is, people can attend these courses if there's room, not do any of the homework, any of the papers, any of the exams. They can sit there, participate in the discussions, and soak up the knowledge. My friend and I are now taking 2 courses each semester in Heidelberg. We just got approved for 2 politics courses this semester. I'm not trying to brag, nor judge others who do not have many books or who no longer take courses. I'm just setting the stage here. To me, education is incredibly important. I will never stop learning. Heck, I've already decided I can't die before I'm 100 because I have too much to learn. That is why it is so worrying to me that the Trump administration is going out of its way to destroy education in America. Well, maybe not destroy it per se, but certainly overhaul it to only teach what it likes.
In a few moments, I will sign an executive order to begin eliminating the Federal Department of Education once and for all.
One of the major points Trump made in his campaign has been that he will dismantle the Department of Education. He chose Linda McMahon as his Secretary of Education. She's going to give it the smackdown. She has had a long and illustrious career as the co-owner with her husband Vince McMahon of the World Wrestling Federation, later World Wrestling Entertainment. They have been very successful over the decades, but that's not education. McMahon did go to college for a French degree in a program that was designed to prepare teachers. That means she may have planned to become a French teacher, but she did not earn a teaching degree. Instead, she ended up translating French documents for a while. Very good job, not an issue. McMahon was involved with charities to promote education and literacy using wrestlers from her company. So far, this is very limited interaction with educational endeavors. In 2009, she was on the Connecticut State Board of Education. She remained on the board for 1 year and resigned. There was backlash over the vetting questionnaire she filled out about her educational background when she claimed she had a degree in education, when in reality, it was only a general French degree.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the President of the United States, it is my great privilege to be here today to administer the oath of office to Linda McMahon, the next administrator of the Small Business Administration.
From 2017 to 2019, during Trump's first term, McMahon served as the administrator of the Small Business Administration. Once again, not education. Most of her time in governmental circles has been 2 failed Senate elections and fundraising for Republicans and Trump. Yes, McMahon has voiced her opinions about education and endorsed charter schools and school choice, but that does not make her an educational expert. Yet here she is, the Secretary of Education. Of course, this comes as no surprise. Trump's first Secretary of Education also had no experience in the field. This is actually not the norm for this position. Since this department was created in 1979, most of the secretaries have had educational backgrounds. Many of them taught either K through 12 or university. Only a few, and there were some, came from another field. Thus, most of them had experience with what worked, what didn't work in education. They had clear ideas based on their experience and maybe how to help American schools and colleges.
When President Carter created the Federal Education Department in 1979,
The current administration loves to point out the department was only created in 1979. That does not mean there was no educational department before then. In 1953, President Eisenhower created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. The educational sector was a subdepartment. Thus, there was still an office dedicated to education at the federal level. It was not strictly a state-level issue like is claimed today. Even in 1953, the idea was not new. President Harding floated the idea for a Department of Education and Welfare in 1923, and others suggested something similar until Eisenhower implemented it. Heck, President Johnson, not Lyndon Baines, but the first one, in 1867, signed legislation to create a Department of Education. The Office of Education was formed within the Department of the Interior. Look at that. Education was important and pushed for by administrations for nearly 150 years. Now we have Trump and McMahon completely dismantling it and throwing a few bits of the rubble into other departments.
So the president is going to abolish parts of the DOE, set in stone by Congress. So he can't shut it down because Congress established it. Okay, so only Congress can abolish it. However, he can trim the fat.
Before anyone brings up the argument that the department used to be a sub-department and obviously is bloated now, it should be noted America was much smaller in 1953, and that's just 1953, we're not even looking at the 1860s. There were about 155 million people in 1953 versus more than twice that now, with about 340 million. Times have changed. We are also focused on far more details in education than in the past. To give an example, in the early 2000s, my father sat on his village council as a selectman. Kind of like a counselor. It's a New England thing. The village decided to raise the school taxes to help pay for improvements to the school and curriculum. Okay, sounds good. Nobody likes taxes, but it's for a good cause. One villager asked what they needed all the money for. When told it was necessary to update the science materials and other tools, this villager actually stated what was wrong with the education they had growing up: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Yes, there are still people who think students only need to learn the absolute basics. Well, this translates to the Department of Education. School is more than just the 19th century one-room schoolhouse with the school marm who hits bad kids with a switch or places them in the corner with a dunce cap. We have moved far beyond McGuffey primers and 100 years of American history. Hey, by the way, these books, they helped me teach my kids to read when they were like 3-4 years old, but it's not the extent of our education today. Our schools teach advanced mathematics and various types of science, including biology, chemistry, physics, bringing our students into the 21st century. They learn about computers, basic programming. In the 90s, I had only one computer course in high school as an elective, and it was focused on how to use Microsoft Office and typing. We're not there anymore, folks. We are far beyond this. These subjects need funding. They need oversight. Yes, the curriculum is still mandated by the states, but there are national issues at play as well.
70% of eighth graders are not proficient in either reading or in math. 70%. 40% of fourth graders lack even basic reading skills, can't read.
Trump pointed out America's done poorly on test scores against the rest of the world. He even wrote this in his executive order. Today, American reading and math scores are near historical lows. This year's National Assessment of Educational Progress showed that 70% of eighth graders were below proficient in reading, and 72% were below proficient in math. One of the jobs of the department is to track American schools and students' progress. One of the first offices Trump closed was the one which did this very task. After all, Musk and Doge found it was government waste. So Trump does not like how poorly Americans fare compared to the rest of the world. To combat that, America should get rid of tracking and seeing where Americans need to improve. Instead, it's better to simply shove the truth under the rug and ignore it. This makes sense. Even if students do poorer, Trump can claim America's the best, because there will be no data to contradict this. Another task of the department is to handle federal financial aid. This is supposed to be thrown now to the Small Business Administration. Well, that works. It's all about money. Student loans involve money, and the Small Business Administration involves money. Since it is the same, why shouldn't the same office handle both? Except it's not the same. First of all, student aid is disseminated very differently than business loans. In addition, the shift has made a complete mess of financial aid. Those who took out student loans are unable to enroll in income-based repayment plans. There were plans in place that adjusted loan repayments based on how much the student earned after leaving school. Higher earners were slated to pay more per month and pay their loans back quicker. Lower earners were cut a little slack and had their monthly payments extended but reduced. Sorry, but the days of almost being guaranteed a good salary due to a college degree, they're gone. Many who leave college are financially hurting. This repayment plan helped. The offices that deal with special needs students will be overseen by the Department of Health and Human Services. Aside from the fact that the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kennedy, has questionable theories on health issues already, this was meant to be overseen by the Department of Education. It is not simply a matter of getting medication to those who need it. The special needs offices were in charge of making certain students with disabilities receive fair and equal education regardless of their issues. If we look at the history of America, it is only fairly recently that people with special needs have been properly integrated. There were 3 acts passed which bring us to the special education programs offered today. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 demanded people with disabilities cannot be discriminated against in the workforce. In particular, Section 504 handles federal funding. No otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States, as defined in Section 7, shall solely by reason of his handicap be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. As pretty much all schools receive federal funding, there cannot be discrimination against disabled students. Granted, the key phrase, no otherwise qualified handicapped individual, did limit who was included. Some disabilities were deemed unqualifying. Then came the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, just 2 years later. This covered those previously deemed unqualified. Then it was mandated that no child is excluded. This is why when I was in public school in the 1980s and 90s, there were classrooms for disabled children. They had every right to a full education as those of us noted as without any disabilities. A physical or mental limitation was not an acceptable reason to bar someone from education. In 1990, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was signed into law by President Bush. The main difference between this and the 1975 Act was the previous act focused on the disability of the child and built an educational program around the disability, potentially ignoring the individual child's capabilities. Just because 2 children have cerebral palsy, for example, does not mean they have the exact same academic capabilities or limitations. The 1990 Act took this into account and designed programs around the child instead. In an age when most students go to schools which have special education programs available, it may not seem like an issue, but even for a good portion of the 20th century, this was not the case. It was far more common to place children with various disabilities in special homes. Those with more extreme physical limitations like deafness or blindness would often be sent to special schools if their families could afford them. The idea was they were not mentally limited, so they could still learn a trade. Those who were mentally affected, like those with Down syndrome, were written off as unable to learn and a strain on society. In many cases, they were not even sent to special schools, but simply to mental institutions for the rest of their life. As Chris Burke, who played Corky on Life Goes On in the 1990s, showed, no, these children should be integrated in society and education and are just as capable as anyone else to succeed if an effort is put forth by educators. Now these children and their needs are being shunted off to the Department of Health and Human Services. Will they actually worry about their educational needs or just write them off and only focus on, potential medical needs? Maybe they could even take a lesson from Nazi Germany. The Nazis took disabled children and sent them to special homes if they were not already in them. Yay! They would tell the parents it was so the children had better care. Then after a short period, the children would suddenly become deathly ill. So ill, the families could not see them due to contagion. Of course, this was followed by death. In actuality, these children were put to death by medical personnel since they were deemed a blight on Earth and should be taken out of the gene pool. Most of those who escaped death were forcibly sterilized. We are not at this point currently, but dismantling education is the first step. Even with the rather long history of education under federal rule to an extent in America, the Trump administration is working to eliminate the department. Yes, the Department of Education technically needs to be closed by congressional approval, but this really is not the issue at this point. With it dismantled from the inside and various offices transferred to other departments, all that's left is a shell that calls itself the Department of Education. Nothing functional is left behind to work with. The Department of Education is not the only aspect to dismantling education right now. Trump is on the warpath against universities. As I discussed in the manipulation of information video, the administration withheld hundreds of millions of dollars in various federal funding from Columbia University with the stipulation they overhaul their Middle Eastern department and battle anti-Semitism and curb protests on the campus. This is pretty ugly. Even though Columbia had policies in place, Trump looked at how he could wield power over the university to limit what they taught. Columbia is not the only university under attack. Harvard was threatened it would lose about $9 billion. We're not talking millions now. $9 billion worth of funding if they did not change policies that the administration demanded. The administration wrote the university a letter demanding face masks are banned. Harvard must also clarify its campus speech policies that limit the time, place, and manner of protest and other activities. Academic departments that fuel anti-Semitic harassment have to be reviewed and changed. There needs to be more diversity. Wait, really? More diversity? But isn't diversity, equity, and inclusion bad? Oh, I guess only the diversity that doesn't cater to the administration. Whoopsie.
My administration has taken action to abolish all discriminatory diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay, so let's look at Harvard. They must be horribly woke and at the same time anti-Semitic. So let's confirm their complete lack of Jewish studies and social groups. Well, I cannot find a Jewish studies degree on offer. Except once I look under the Near East studies degrees, there is the Jewish studies section. According to the study, students focus on various topics, including history, literature, music, etc. So various aspects of Judaism as it crops up in other departments. In other words, this is one of those cross-departmental degrees. This is quite common as departments work together to help a student focus their studies. Okay, so maybe there's some courses. Still, I bet there are no organizations to help Jewish students feel welcome. Damn. There are services, like the umbrella group Harvard Hillel, which includes various Jewish organizations. Maybe, just maybe, it is not anti-Semitism at play here, or at least not in the sense Trump and his staff keep trying to draw attention to. Other universities are under similar attack right now, such as pulling $1 billion from Cornell University, $790 million from Northwestern University. In the case of Harvard, nearly 800 faculty members sent a letter to the Harvard Corporation and Board of Overseers stating the school needs to resist Trump's demands and publicly condemn the attack on America's universities. That included professors from Jewish studies. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission subpoenaed the University of California for the employment status and contact information of hundreds of faculty in the university system. Why? Because they signed 2 open letters to the government, one in October of 23, the other in May of 24. In these letters, they both condemned the Hamas attack on Israel, but they also dared to show sympathy for the people in Gaza. At the University of California at Berkeley, Professor Severin Borenstein signed the first letter. That means he must be a raging anti-Semite to show sympathy for Gazans, except he's Jewish. He is quoted as saying, "I think this is just part of the Trump administration using anti-Semitism as a smokescreen to attack higher education." Of course, this man is obviously an exception, and most Jews support Trump. Well, no. 3 professors from Yale University just took positions with the University of Toronto in Canada. They're getting the hell out of Dodge. The first 2 are a married couple, Professors Timothy Snyder and Marcy Shore. Snyder specializes in the Holocaust, served on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Board. Shore has been a professor of Jewish studies in different universities. Both of these professors teach about Jewish history. Okay, they themselves are not Jewish, but they're still very supportive of Jewish issues and history. The third professor, John Stanley, he's a professor of philosophy. Well, not part of the Jewish department. Oh, he is Jewish. All three of these professors left because of the political climate in America, and Stanley specifically joined the other two after attacks on the universities by the administration. They do not see these attacks as making the schools less anti-Semitic, but recognize them as carefully designed attempts to control what is taught and limit students and staff.
Executive orders eliminating DEI content from your curriculum and campuses.
In the attempt to curb DEI practices in the military academies were targeted. 2 courses at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and the Naval Academy at Annapolis were canceled. The Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs marked 3 courses to potentially cancel. These were only the courses canceled. Other courses were altered to change the readings, so texts which fell under DEI scrutiny were not used. The argument could be made that in this environment, students would be forced to accept what was taught and could not argue with the teachings.
Which says to me, there was not a lot of this extraneous DEI woke content in your courses.
So the military was forced to spend time and money going over all of the courses they offered and scrub them. Okay, what about then the approximately 400 books removed from the Naval Academy's library? They were removed from the school because they did not comply with DEI. I read through the list of books. Most of them dealt with race issues in America, sexuality, and trans issues. The problem here is not that the students were force-fed the books. Instead, these were books already purchased and in the library. Students have the opportunity to check these books out if they so desire and then read them. They are not forced to write papers supporting the ideas in the books. Instead, they may read them and they may agree, or they may read them and they may disagree. By making the books available, students have the necessary tools to engage in critical thinking. Instead, the government decided this was not acceptable and demanded any literature with topics they disagreed with be banned. One of the books that was on this list, I read back in the 1990s. It's called Lies My Teachers Told Me. I still have this book decades later. I grabbed this book off my bookshelf the other night just to look back over it and see what was so horrible. When I first read the book, it's actually what made me consider homeschooling when I had children. I'm not religious, and I never wanted to push religion on my children. No, this book made me realize that history was not always taught accurately, and I wanted my children to learn the facts, not the stories the writers wanted to try and spin while manipulating the truth. When I was in grade school and even high school, I learned that Columbus was the only one who thought the world was round, and everyone thought he was going to sail off the edge of the earth, including his sailors. Guess what? Completely false. Most of the educated classes and most sailors thought the world was round. Kind of knew about this whole horizon thing, and it had been, proven in ancient Greece. His sailors were angry with him because his search for an alternative route to India was taking too long and they did not want to die of starvation, not a fear of falling off the earth. This book also showed me that all the biographies I read about Helen Keller as a child only focused more on the child and how she stopped acting like an animal once someone taught her how to communicate. None of the books mentioned how she supported communism and socialist movements in America. That is mainly what this book covers. Looking back through, I see nothing so much about DEI issues, but rather that the book points out American government and people were not always so good and hid that in the history books. We learn about the first Thanksgiving in school and all the wonderful relations between Pilgrims and Native Americans. We do not learn about how Pilgrims dug up Native American graves and took supplies buried with the bodies like pottery to help them survive their first years in America, which is in primary sources and diaries of Pilgrims. We have records on this. That is why this book was removed. Another book on the list was I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. I read this in high school. It's the author's autobiography of racism when she grew up in the 1930s, 40s Missouri. Yes, this book even contained her account of being raped as a child at 8 years old. Sorry if this offends some people, but having the book in the Academy Library does not mean the students are forced to read it. It does give them the option, though. However, this book addresses racism, and those currently in charge do not want to address this. That's been solved. They are adamant that racism has been contained and is blown out of proportion by people seeking attention and special treatment. Thus, any books covering this topic, we gotta get rid of them. They're not nice. It is not only the military academies. On the military bases, the school libraries have endured similar purges. The same plan was implemented. Any military facilities with federal funding need to get rid of books that are deemed DEI. Let me make this perfectly clear. This does not mean the books are then offered up to the populace in case anyone would like to take the books home. No, they are destroyed. I'm not joking. When I worked for a time at a library on an army base, we cleared out books that had not been checked out in over a year. The idea was to clear up some shelf space for new books. I did the search in the system personally, and really the only filter I made was to see when the books were last checked out. There were tons of young children's books that I pulled. I asked, could we try and sell them for a few cents just to make some money for the library? I was told no. The library was not allowed to handle money. It wasn't in their system. Okay. I asked, could we put them in a box and offer them for free, a please take box? No. Okay. Rather than have these books simply tossed, I said I would love to take some home for my children to read. Again, no, that was not allowed. Since they were bought with government funds, the rule was they could not be given away. Instead, we literally had to rip the covers off before throwing them in the dumpster. As a bibliophile, my heart broke. We had to destroy books because the government could not give them away after spending money on them. This is exactly what will happen to the various books being pulled off the military shelves and military academy shelves now. How is this any different from burning books? In either case, they are damaged and people will not grab them to read. It is very easy to say the books are not really gone. People can still go out and buy them, sure, but not everyone has the money to buy all the books they want to read. That is the whole point of libraries. I devoured books in college, far more than I could have if I had to buy all of them. I could wander down the various shelves in the libraries, heading to my favorite sections, then I could grab whatever piqued my interest at that moment. Many of the books would not have been on my radar if I were specifically looking for books to order. Heck, as a youth, my father would drop me at the county library for up to 2 hours. He limited me to 2 hours, and I would leave with a stack of 10 to 20 books. When we first could dial up the library's card catalog and over-the-computer reserve books, I was one of those that caused the library to limit how many books could be reserved at any one time. No joke. Today, I utilize Heidelberg University's interlibrary loan to get books the library does not even have in their stacks. They pull it from around the world. For €2, I can have any book pulled from other libraries around Europe and a little more if outside of Europe. €2 versus €100 some of these limited print or specialty print books cost. This is a major help. I couldn't afford that. Also, many bookstores, they do not keep these books on their shelves. Except for some classics, books tend to have very short lifespans in bookstores. It's usually the new bestseller or the new hot topic. The shelves are constantly stocked with the new books to increase sales. That's why I prefer used bookstores. They tend to have different selections. There is no excuse to remove them. So people are still very limited to accessing these books without libraries. Another issue in removing all these books is that the history is simply hidden. Another story from my youth. I grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood. Even today, there is a very large Hasidic population. I remember sitting on the floor of the town's or the city's public library reading the back of Mein Kampf. As I did so, an elderly Hasidic man looked down at me with disapproval. Very uncomfortable. I still checked out the book. I'm glad I did, and I've read it a few times over the years. I knew when I grabbed it what it was about. I wanted to read it to try and understand why Hitler hated the Jews so much to do what he did. I did not fall for any of the propaganda and the lies, but I needed to be able to critically analyze what happened and not just listen to secondhand accounts or someone else's analysis. Even the very ugly should not be hidden. We need to have access to all knowledge. This goes for landmarks too. A few years ago, it was very popular to attack statues of Southern Civil War generals. Eventually, many of them were taken down. While many African Americans supported this, it actually does them a disservice. This once again hides the bad history. Instead, officials should have taken a page out of Germany's book. A Jewish man petitioned to remove a 13th century anti-Semitic relief on a church in Wittenberg. The courts decreed the relief would remain. The same church erected a memorial previously to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. In response to the anti-Semitic depiction, also before this lawsuit, a plaque was placed which explained the context of the image. The image was clarified rather than removed and ignored for the future. The church leaders took the time to try and teach the public about the image of Jews by the church in the Middle Ages. The same should have been done for the Civil War statues. Instead, more evidence of systematic racism and slavery was removed. In the long run, this hurts the groups who were victimized in the past. Less and less is taught about the past because it is not pleasant, or it doesn't apply today. This leads to forgetting the past. Look at the Holocaust. It is almost out of living memory. As of 2024, it was estimated there were only about 245,000 Holocaust survivors left alive. That is in comparison to the approximately 3.5 million who initially survived. When I was in high school and middle school and high school, we actually had Holocaust survivors, not somebody who was Jewish during the time of the war, Holocaust survivors with the tattoo that were in the concentration camps. Every year they would come to our school and they would talk about their experiences. We had the living memory. But living memory is going away now, and it shows. We see this. There has been a surge in voting for extremist political parties in the last few years. Germans have actually voted for politicians who promote Nazi ideals and use Nazi phraseology. I've mentioned the AfD a few times now. This is the same nation that really tries to make sure future generations never repeat the crimes of the past, really beating it into students' heads about the Holocaust and what happened. However, the younger generations have no connection to the war and the Holocaust, and they listen to the rhetoric of hate and vote for it. During the first Trump administration, there were calls to round up Muslims and place them in holding camps, kind of like America did to the Japanese during World War II. Many of those who fought for civil rights were African Americans, and even more so those who fought for women's rights earlier on. They've passed away. Now we see more and more protections being repealed. While there is still quite a lot of inequality in America, people have no memory of earlier times when it was much worse. Most have no memory of women were not allowed to vote, open their own bank account, seek protection from marital rape. That's one for you. It was only in 1993 that marital rape became a crime at the federal level. I was a teenager. This is why education is so important. When living memory dies away, we have the history books, we have the original sources, the museum displays, etc. to help us remember. The museum displays, the libraries. Oh yeah, isn't that another department under attack right now? The entire Institute of Museum and Library Services staff has been placed on administrative leave for up to 90 days. Every other time this happened to a department, the department was gutted. Now it's their turn. The IMLS provides funding to libraries, museums, and archives nationwide. The last time you were in your local library, did you see how cheap the library card was for the year? This is not enough to pay for all the services libraries offer as well as the books and the staff payroll. Instead, federal and state aid helps. Large libraries like the New York Public Library, they're likely to survive, though still with major cuts. They have numerous donors to help offset what the government provides. Local libraries in smaller towns and villages get hit hard, though. There have been cutbacks in libraries over the years already. I've even seen local libraries get closed due to a lack of funding. This creates educational deserts. We talk about food deserts when there's no grocery stores in a town. No library, educational desert. People use libraries for more than just checking out books. Even today, with cell phones, not everyone has easy access to the internet, especially if you're more rural and you don't have the best signal. Even when they do, there are some things which are simply easier to do on a computer, like filling out important forms. Libraries often provide basic printing services if those forms need to be physically mailed in. Cities have print shops, but small towns and regions usually do not. Libraries often offer various programs like Storytime for Toddlers to help encourage reading, or they may help with basic services like taxes and dealing with government forms. Museums again display the past so we can remember. Many of the collections are static and do not change, but there are usually temporary exhibits which deal with current topics and rotate the collections which are too large to keep everything on display. A lot of stuff in museums tends to be in storage. This takes time and planning by the staff for which they need to be paid. There are actually degrees in library science and museum studies. These services hire experts in their field. The same goes for archives. In addition to storing old documents and artifacts for research, many of these need to be preserved as they grow fragile over time. Again, experts in archival studies are hired to keep the past accessible at any time for those doing research. As an academic, I've had to visit numerous archives to read through old documents. Not everything has been digitized, not even close to half of what is out there has been digitized, and even that costs money. It takes staff time to go through all the materials carefully, scan it, properly catalog it to make it available online, and then they still have to pay for the servers that make it available online. That takes money. Do you like doing genealogy? Sure, there are paid sites like Ancestry, but where do you think they get those documents from? They send employees to archives to copy the information and then they put it behind a paywall. Every time they come out with new census records, those come from the United States Census Bureau's records. That is another archive that receives federal funding. That is more history that helps us educate ourselves. You know what else education does? It encourages people to question authority. While parents may not like the concept with their children, there are times when we need to question authority. Heck, America was built on that very concept. If the educated classes did not question the English monarchy's rule, the United States would not exist as it does now. Leaders on American soil questioned how they were ruled. They looked at the past and even wrote texts referencing governments in history. They used their knowledge and stood up for what they believed in. That is how America today was created. In 1837, Horace Mann was appointed Secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. While in office, he visited European schools to get ideas for educational reform in America. One model that resonated with him was the Prussian model. There were a few key points that did not already exist in schools. I'm going to cover two of them briefly. One was free primary schooling, so elementary school. When we watch old television shows like Little House on the Prairie, we see the children running to the one-room schoolhouse. Isn't that quaint? Yet this came long after schooling reform in America. Before then, the schools were usually privately run and students of all ages had to pay tuition. School was not mandatory and many could not afford it. So they simply never went and never learned even the most basic skills like reading and simple arithmetic. The Prussian model made elementary school available to everyone. A second point from the Prussian model, professional teachers were trained in specialized colleges. Historically, in America, like in other countries, primary school teachers were not college trained. Again, look at Laura Ingalls Wilder from the aforementioned Little House on the Prairie fame. After she finished the 8th grade, she went on to earn a teaching certificate at age 15. She became a teacher at 16. Technically, the legal age in the Dakota territories, because they weren't states yet, was 18, but this was often overlooked due to the need for teachers. Could you imagine this today? No teacher is younger than 21 after finishing a 4-year degree, and in some states like New York, they have to later go on to earn a master's to continue teaching. The Prussian model led to this. My alma mater for my bachelor's was SUNY Oswego. When it was opened in 1861, it was the Oswego Primary Teachers Training School. It then became a teacher's college before it became part of the state university system that I attended, with numerous other degrees offered, of which I partook. However, while the Prussian model potentially improved the quality of education offered and offered it to more people, it did still have an underlying goal. It was meant to control the populace, give them education and access to knowledge, well, some knowledge. Students focused a lot on memorizing facts and figures, reciting. Oration was very popular. Students would be told to read passages clearly and with the proper inflection, elocution. Much like my generation and other living generations had to learn proper handwriting, we had to look or sound good. Students were not encouraged to question, though. Instead, most students who left school would either be farmers or go into industrial jobs, working on assembly lines and doing simple tasks. It is not good to put revolutionary ideas in their heads that help them question their status and want more out of life. Yes, some went on to higher education. This was not necessarily college, but even high school was considered higher education, and not all schools and villages and towns offered this. Most students never went beyond the 8th grade. Again, this was a common mindset. College and even high school was for the higher classes, who would go on to be the managers and owners in the factories, not the masses. Do you like this? Do you want America to go back to this? Be very careful when certain politicians and talking heads say America needs to go back to the good old days and traditional education. A good education today, particularly at the university level, encourages students to question the status quo. There are places like South Korea which actually encourage their students to engage in protests. They have that freedom which was not always there and are encouraged to use it so it does not disappear. Liberal universities in Europe and America have been supportive of student protests. Yes, liberal universities or liberal administrations, not conservative. That is because the liberal leaders in universities know how important it is that students speak out against what they feel is unjust. It does not mean everything will go the way the students demand. It does not mean the administrators fully agree. but they do respect their freedom of speech. Look at all the Israel-Gaza protests. In America, the news lambasted the students protesting against the Israeli government. Please note, contrary to what the media claimed, most of the protesters have nothing against Jews. They do not hate the Jews. They are upset with the Israeli government. Even Jewish students have been involved in these protests on the side of Gaza. These protesters do not support Hamas. They do not support Hamas. They are protesting against the bombing of innocent civilians in Gaza. They are protesting against the forced removal of Gazans from their homes for over half a century so Israel can expand its borders. Yet the American government interceded and shut down these protests. Professors who approved of these protests are being investigated, and the university administrations are supporting this. In Germany, a top education ministry official called to cut funding of any academics who spoke in favor of pro-Palestinian students. Unlike many administrators and government officials in the US, she was not supported in her actions. The news exploded. This was wild. Instead, she was fired from her position for attempting to overstep the line and punish academics for simply speaking out in support of their students. This was phenomenal. The German government decided the nation is not a police state and people have the freedom to protest. We claim students have free speech just like all Americans in America, but do they really? I mean, we're already seeing the Trump administration, taking away students' visas because they dare to exercise their right as legal immigrants on free speech. Look back at the Kent State shootings in 1970. Students spoke out against the Vietnam War. The Ohio National Guard was called in to break up the protests. They then killed 4 students and injured 9. The killed were not even all involved in the protest. One of them, Sandra Scheuer, was simply walking to her next class when the National Guard opened fire and shot her in the neck, killing her. In the 1930s, Nazi Germany restricted education. Nazi administrators completely dismantled the educational structure. That sounds familiar. They took the Prussian model to a whole new level. I read a book about the Nazification of Heidelberg University. Aside from the standard practice of removing Jews from all the schools along with every other job in the nation, the Nazis also removed others who did not support them. Communists were deported, and professors who did not support Nazi educational goals were either demoted to minimal positions or outright fired. Many of the administrators who took over were considered subpar when they were in school and doing their PhDs and not fit to be educational leaders. However, they were ardent supporters of the Nazis and put in positions of power because they forwarded the Nazi ideology. In K through 12, students were pumped full of lessons about eugenics and how to spot Jews and why they were horrible beasts. Really, it was extreme. Talking about what was wrong with their looks, how they were filthy, how they smelled. It was stupid. They were taught instead how to be good soldiers and homemakers for the regime and how to increase the Aryan population. How is this much different than the Trump administration telling universities they need to overhaul their Middle East studies departments and focus more on Jewish studies? In many of these cases, the universities already have large and well-developed Jewish studies departments. The subject is not being ignored, it's not being suppressed. What is being suppressed now is studies of the Middle East. What comes next? Do we start having classes on eugenics about how European Americans are superior? We did have such studies in our past, quite common, some of which only petered out after World War II and the backlash due to the Nazi eugenics programs. This is why education is so important, and the current administration should not be able to curb it when and where it wants, simply because it contradicts with what the government says. Students are the next generation. Current and past administrations make mistakes. Heck, even our current administration has said this a couple times now. Should we continue in a downward spiral because the government refuses to let our children learn and speak up? Maybe we should keep our hands off education and encourage schools, libraries, museums, and archives to provide all there is, the good, the bad, the ugly. Teach the students to truly critically analyze and let them decide for themselves what is right. We should not train them to be obedient dogs or parrots, but encourage them to have minds of their own. And this takes funding. So do not dismantle the Department of Education, but continue to fund it. Do not dismantle the museums, the libraries, and the archives. Continue to fund them. You know the drill. Hit your Congress members with paper letters mailed to their offices. These are harder to ignore. In less than 2 years, we get to vote in the midterm elections. Maybe you will even run in those elections. Shape your future.
you.